Hello, my name is Gregor McHardy. I'm the author of 8 Myths of the Great Apostasy, and I'd like to take a minute to talk to you about one of the myths in that book, to introduce the book to you. Now, one of the myths that we sometimes purport is that Peter was not the first pope. Now, I understand this sentiment. If Peter was the first pope, and Pope Francis is his direct line successor, that would mean the keys of the kingdom given to Peter might just have been passed down. Now, we're not the only ones who disbelieve this claim. As a matter of fact, we've inherited from the religious tradition of the Reformation. They claimed that there never was an office of leadership over the entire church. So, if we tacitly acknowledge this claim, as we do by buying into the claim that Christ did not establish his church on Peter, but on the rock of revelation, then our claim that Peter appeared to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery to restore the keys of the priesthood leaves him without possession of those keys in the first place. Since we know that he did, we'll have to ditch our support of the myth. Peter, then, was the first pope. Pope? Peter? No, that doesn't sound right. So, let's consider for a moment, what does the word pope mean? Now, it is an odd-sounding word, and because of some really questionable historic popes over the years, it leaves us with a bad taste in our mouths. You and I, as Latter-day Saints, would say that Peter, James, and John were the equivalent of the First Presidency of today. Only problem is, president wasn't a word that was in use back in those days. The best he could have been called was archos of the apostles. That's a Greek word, arch apostle, a word that's been translated in the English scriptures as chief apostle. We have no idea what title Peter was actually given as leader of the primitive church, but there is some precedent by other writers of that time that the word could have been episkopos, a Greek word literally meaning one who oversees or supervises. We recognize that word in the modern name of the Episcopal Church, a branch of the English church that supports the calling and authority of bishops. Hence, even modern Catholics call Peter the first bishop of Rome and claim that his bishopric took precedence over all other bishoprics at his times. If we acknowledge that he was the bishop, meaning the supervisor and not a ward leader, I don't think we have a problem with this. It is the confused use of a distasteful word, pope, that gets to us. So, what does pope mean? Well, it descends from the Latin term for papa, or father. Now, we LDS have 15 acknowledged prophets in the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. The other 14 are lowercase prophets, while the president is uppercase prophet, and Joseph Smith is full uppercase the prophet. Catholics, in turn, have their own priests, bishops, archbishops, each of whom are called father, probably with increasing uppercasedness until you reach the big father, or the papa, or il papa. And to be fair, although for the most part the LDS adhere to Christ's injunction to call no man father upon the earth, you've got to admit that we still consider our ward to be a family, with the head of the family being the father of the ward. I'm not saying it's right, but in that regard, we're following the same precedent the Catholics followed years ago. So it comes down to a matter of semantics. We dislike the word pope, mainly because we don't understand it, because it's been handed down to us for 500 years that everything smacking of popery is abhorrent. Now, were we in charge of naming Peter's office? We would call it president. But since we weren't around, it called something that gradually descended as father in another language, papa, pope. If we could both just call him the leader of the church, everyone would be equally happy. The Catholics, however, have about 1,500 years of literature they would have to go back and amend. So perhaps we can be gracious and let him be known as the Pope, and that he is the successor to Peter's leadership of the early church. Now, does that mean we acknowledge that all these popes also held or now hold the keys of the kingdom? Obviously not. Peter had to come back and restore them. Hence, we believe at some time they were lost. Do we know where? Some think they do.
Most assume that Peter was the last one to hold them because he was the one who came back to restore them. But remember Elijah, who transferred the keys both to Peter on the Mount of Transfiguration and to Joseph in the Kirtland Temple?
After he was caught up in heaven in mortality, his deputy Elisha continued to exercise his keys, as witnessed by his taking up the mantle of Elijah. He that holds the keys to a dispensation is not necessarily the last. Even we acknowledge in our panegyric to Joseph that ever and ever the keys he will hold, even though the current uppercased prophet wields those keys in our day. Now, in my book, I point out some forgotten literature that suggests very strongly that Peter passed on the keys of his presidency, that the apostleship did not cease with the deaths of the original 12, but continued on. How far? Unknown, but at least far enough to establish a tradition among the rising church that among all its leaders, those who lived in Rome had the supremacy. You can read more in my book about this and several other myths from which we might want to distance ourselves, and how this plays out with our relationship with our fellow followers of Christ and his precepts around the world. I hope you'll want to purchase and read my book. Thank you for your time.